Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I handed my parents $600 every single week for an entire year, thinking that money meant security for them, stability for the house, and maybe even some respect for me. But when the long-awaited family vacation finally rolled around, they looked me in the eye and said, almost casually, that they didn't want me there, and 24 hours later my phone was buried under missed calls. That's the kind of line that doesn't leave your mind easily, because it slices through every illusion you built about where you stood in the family, who you were to them, and how disposable your sacrifices turned out to be. You tell yourself it must be some kind of mistake, some sort of cruel slip of the tongue, but it wasn't. They meant it, and I'll never forget the way my father's lips barely moved when he said it, like he couldn't even be bothered to wrap the rejection in polite words. To understand why those words stung so deep, you'd have to see the year that came before it. Every Friday, I came home from my job at the insurance office, still wearing the cheap heels that left blisters on my feet, still carrying the same bag I'd had since college, and I'd hand over an envelope with 6 crisp bills. $600, gone before I could even decide if I wanted to save some for myself, gone before I thought about taking a trip of my own or buying something that didn't come from the discount rack. I told myself it was temporary, that my parents were struggling, that bills were suffocating them, and that my 2 brothers couldn't contribute much because, according to my mom, they had more pressing expenses. Kyle needed to keep upgrading his car, Eric had to invest in his music equipment, and apparently I, the eldest daughter, was the responsible one who could be counted on. I started cutting corners so sharply that my life felt like it was bleeding out in little ways. I skipped dinners with coworkers because I couldn't afford appetizers. I rotated between 3 outfits so I wouldn't look like a complete mess at work, and I convinced myself that being the steady provider was my role, that it was some unspoken badge of honor. But the badge began to feel more like a shackle when I'd overhear conversations in the living room, my brothers bragging about their weekends, my parents nodding proudly at their trivial accomplishments, while my own sacrifices were treated as background noise, something expected rather than valued. The final insult arrived in June, when the talk of the family vacation started. I overheard it first as background chatter, my mom scrolling through hotels on her tablet, my brothers debating beach spots, my dad comparing airline deals. I waited for my name to come up, for someone to ask about my work schedule, to consider whether I could get the same week off. But my name never surfaced. Instead, there was laughter, jokes about just the 4 of us finally relaxing, as if I didn't exist in their picture of a family getaway. I confronted my mom gently at first, asking if plans were being made. She smiled too brightly and said they were still figuring things out. My father wasn't as delicate. He looked me dead in the eye one night at dinner and said, "We didn't want you there." Just like that. The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate, but nobody even flinched. Kyle smirked, Eric avoided eye contact. My mom started cutting her chicken like she hadn't heard a thing. My father didn't add a reason, didn't soften it with excuses. The words landed and stuck like cement. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection under the yellow light. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come, not then. I kept hearing his voice replay in my head, not cruel in tone, but detached, like he was removing me from the picture of his life as easily as you delete a file on a computer. I tried to breathe, tried to convince myself I had misheard, but the silence on the other side of the door confirmed everything. They weren't going to call me back to the table with reassurances. They weren't going to apologize. The next day at work, my coworker Jessica asked what I was doing for the summer, and without thinking, I lied. I said I wasn't sure yet, that maybe I'd take a trip later in the year. She started talking about her plans in Florida while I nodded along, feeling that hot sting in my throat, the kind that comes when you realize you're invisible in the place that should have seen you the clearest. I kept my smile steady, but my mind kept drifting back to the envelope I had handed over the week before, and the one before that, and the dozens before, each one a piece of me chipped away for nothing. That night, I overheard them talking about luggage in the living room, my mom fussing over outfits, my brothers bragging about jet skis, my dad chuckling about finally getting a break. I sat upstairs, staring at my ceiling, realizing they weren't ashamed, weren't guilty, weren't even aware of the cruelty. They thought it was normal to cut me out. I whispered, "Got it," to myself, the same words I said when I confirmed their rejection to my face, and something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to beg for a seat on that plane. I wasn't going to hand over another $600 for the privilege of being treated like trash. They thought I was the quiet, obedient daughter who would always take the hit, who would always pay up and never demand anything back. They were wrong. Because while they were packing their suitcases and planning their trip, I was planning something else. And the moment they boarded that plane, I knew the game had shifted. They just hadn't realized it yet. They left 2 mornings later in a fog of cologne and sunscreen, the house smelling like other people's summer while I stood in the doorway holding a mug I didn't want, pretending to sip, pretending to be smaller than I felt. Because playing quiet for 48 hours had given me room to think about every lever I still controlled, every subscription that lived under my email, every autopay that my envelopes had been silently feeding, and every place where my name, never celebrated at the dinner table, sat quietly at the top of an account page like a switch that could be flipped without a speech or a fight. I did not ask for their itinerary, I did not ask where they were staying, and I did not ask who would water the plants, because I already knew what mattered. The phone plan lived under my login because I had opened it years ago when my credit was clean and theirs was not, the roadside assistance membership billed to my card because I had renewed it when the old one lapsed, the streaming bundles and cloud storage and password manager all tied to addresses I paid to keep secure, and the travel credit they loved to borrow for airline booking protections because I had the only card with enough history to unlock those perks. I spent that first evening not crying and not raging, but clicking through dashboards the way you clean a kitchen after a storm, steady and thorough. And with each confirmation email that pinged my inbox, I felt the humiliations of the last 12 months loosen their grip on my chest, because I was not sabotaging anything illegal or cruel. I was reclaiming what I had built and funded. And I was doing it without theatrics, in the same calm register with which they had erased me from there. Vacation photo in advance. I migrated my phone line out of the family plan and downgraded the remainder to the bare minimum because the extra roaming package that Mom had insisted I keep just in case had been billed through my card, and if I was not wanted on their beach, then my card was not wanted on their beach either. I removed their profiles from the password manager and issued a polite note that access would be restored when we could have a respectful conversation about boundaries and basic decency. I ended the roadside assistance add-on for additional drivers because it carried my billing address and, according to the fine print I read when I signed up, extended privileges were optional and revocable by the primary member without cause. Before bed, I opened the bank app and, with a voice that did not tremble even though my fingers remembered how they had trembled the first time I handed over $600 in an envelope, I set up a recurring transfer into my own savings for the exact same amount, to run every Friday before dinner, a little ceremony in reverse that felt like stitching up a wound with the very thread that had cut me. I wrote a short message to my parents that read like an office memo, calm, dry, and impossible to misinterpret, stating that any payments historically made by me toward household utilities or ancillary services would pause until further notice, that I would no longer be available to float last-minute expenses with the promise of later reimbursement, and that any emergencies should be handled through the proper channels such as calling the provider or, in the case of travel issues, contacting the airline or hotel directly. I did not send it yet, because revenge tastes better when it is not rushed, and because timing is an ingredient people forget exists. Morning brought a new energy, a clean quiet that belonged to me, and I used it to pull receipts from the year into a neat stack on my desk, because clarity is its own kind of justice, the numbers, written out on a legal pad in words across the page like a letter to myself, looked obscene when translated into ordinary life. 600 every week meant groceries I did not buy, shoes I did not replace, a dentist appointment I rescheduled twice, and one small weekend trip with a friend that I canceled at the last minute because my father had texted that the electric bill came in higher than expected, and I had said, of course, I've got it, as if I worked for him on salary. I was still reading those lines when my aunt, the one who lives 2 states away but never forgets a birthday, sent a cheerful message asking what beach town we had picked this year, and in that moment I understood something ugly and simple, which is that my parents had not just excluded me, they had crafted a public story. That was easier to post than the truth. So I posted my own truth, not a tantrum and not a manifesto, but a measured sentence beneath a photo of my quiet living room, sunlight on the coffee table like proof that ordinary beauty exists even when people act like cowards. I wrote that I was excited for a stay-at-home week because after a year of supporting the household, I was taking a little break and investing in myself, and I thanked everyone who had ever told me that boundaries are grown, not granted. It was the kind of line that sounds like self-help to strangers and like a siren to the people who know exactly what it means, which is to say my cousins read it and sent side-eye emojis to each other and then, remembering who I am, sent me actual words. The kind that say I see you and I'm proud of you and call me if you want company. By late afternoon, I pressed send on the memo to my parents, the tidy one about paused payments and proper channels, and then I put my phone face down and went to the farmer's market, where I bought berries that tasted like a childhood nobody gave me, and a bunch of flowers that looked excessive in my small kitchen and therefore felt correct. I ate dinner at my own table with the windows open, letting a warm breeze move the receipt stack like a living thing, and I waited for the moment when my quiet adjustments would meet their noisy entitlement somewhere over an airport counter. When my phone finally lit up, it was not with fury yet, but with confusion, Mom asking whether I had changed something small, because the roaming add-on did not appear in the app. Dad asking for the password to the card portal because the hotel deposit had bounced out of nowhere. The tone mighty casual for people who had declared I was unnecessary, and although I did not reply, I allowed myself one slow grin that nobody got to see, because for the first time in months the scale felt like it had moved an inch in my direction. That night, as I set an alarm I did not need and turned out a light I could afford, the first volley of missed calls rolled in and then stopped, like waves that had not yet learned the shore had shifted. And I slept the kind of sleep you earn when you decide to be done with begging. In the gray hush before morning, the phone began again, not tentative now but urgent, and when I lifted the screen I saw my father's name stacked over and over. The kind of stack you get when people who never say, "Please" suddenly discover the word, and I knew the real trip had finally begun. By mid-morning the calls were stacked like a flimsy tower waiting for a breeze, and although my first instinct was to let them wobble on their own, I decided to spend the day doing what I had accidentally become very good at over the last 12 months, which was quietly putting systems in order while other people announced plans they expected me to fund. So I opened a fresh document and began assembling a ledger that no one had asked to see, but everyone would eventually be forced to read. A simple chronology written in full words rather than cold digits, each Friday named and dated, each envelope of 600 recorded beside the bill it rescued or the whim it enabled. Because I wanted a record that could not be waved away as exaggeration or female dramatics or whatever label was easiest when gratitude proved too heavy. While the cursor blinked, I toggled to the financial tabs I knew better than my mother knows her own pantry, revoked every authorized user status that had ever been granted out of optimism, closed the travel protections that depended explicitly on my presence as the primary cardholder, and froze my credit out of pure self-defense. Not because I believed they would open something in my name on purpose, but because a person who can tell a daughter she is not wanted on vacation can also convince himself that a small shortcut is not really a theft if it preserves the story he has told himself about being in charge. When the phone plan portal loaded, I migrated every device that was not mine off the premium tier and into a basic domestic plan that would not pretend to work at the beach. And, because I am not cruel, I added a note to the account indicating that reinstatement would be immediate upon reimbursement of the past due add-ons, as well as a conversation about boundaries conducted in complete sentences without raised voices, and then, anticipating the inevitable accusation that I had abandoned the family in a crisis, I prepared a second note in my drafts explaining that the roadside assistance had always been discretionary under my membership and that I had not, in fact, canceled any policy they personally owned because they did not personally own any, a distinction I knew would land like a door finally clicking shut. The ledger grew, the stack of confirmation emails grew, and with them grew a calm that was not revenge in the theatrical sense, but a slow release from a posture I had held too long, the posture of the dependable oldest child who pays and apologizes and shrinks to fit the room. By early afternoon, a message from my aunt landed, this time not cheerful but clipped, asking if I was with them and whether I knew why my mother's posts about family bonding had disappeared from her feed, which told me two things at once. That public opinion inside the extended family was wobbling, and that my mother was beginning to understand how quickly a curated story collapses when the person behind the curtain stops pulling levers. So I took a deep breath and hit send on the ledger too. Exactly 3 recipients, my mother, my father, and the aunt who never forgets birthdays, attaching a brief cover note that read like a professional invoice, which is to say it was calm, it was specific. And it described not what they owed me in cash, but what they owed me in truth, namely an acknowledgement that I had been the financial spine of the household for a year while being treated like a spare part. I did not include threats. I did not dangle ultimatums. I simply stated that all discretionary contributions were suspended and that any future assistance would require a written plan that did not read like a wish list disguised as obligation. The phone rang again and again, and eventually I let one call travel to voicemail because I wanted documentation I had not produced myself. My father's voice arrived a minute later, thinner than usual and dressed in politeness like a borrowed suit, asking if there had been some confusion with the card because the hotel desk was insisting the deposit reversal had left them with a balance due and the rental counter was being difficult about a second driver who no longer existed in their system, and while he stopped short of an apology, he did not bother with the familiar bark of authority either, which told me the power he enjoyed at our dining room table did not translate in the lobby where someone else held the keys. I listened to the message twice, let the silence between his words wash over me, and then, in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial, I called my bank to report an unreturned card issued to an authorized user who, by policy, was required to surrender it upon removal, a tidy sentence that, when translated into daily life, meant the next time he tried to swipe at a bar disguised as a tiki hut, he would meet the clerical consequences of his own casual erasure of me. With that done, I walked to the small copy shop near the post office and paid to notarize a simple letter that summarized the ledger and restated my boundaries, because if there is one thing I have learned, it is that paperwork outlives indignation. And I slid the sealed envelope into the outgoing bin with a steadiness I did not feel in January when I handed over that first 600, then stopped at the grocery store for a steak I would cook exactly the way I like it, medium rare with a stubborn crust, and a bottle of wine that did not apologize for being good, and I carried those small luxuries home like a citizen of my own life. The calls multiplied while the steak hissed in the pan, evolving from confusion to a tone I barely recognized, a tone with something like worry tucked inside the irritation. And when I finally lifted the phone to clear the notifications, I saw a string of texts from my mother that did not mention deposits or plans or hotel managers, but Kyle, just his name and the words "call me now" repeated over and over with no punctuation, and in that echoing moment I understood that whatever had been unraveling financially was now pulling at another thread entirely, one I could not control with a password or a policy. And the pan hissed on and the phone vibrated again and again while I stood between the stove and the counter wondering, against everything they had taught me this week, whether to pick up. By the time their plane should have been landing, I had already poured myself a glass of wine, set a playlist that I had carefully curated over the past week, and allowed myself to sit back and watch the chaos unfold through channels I had left untouched. The notifications on my phone serving as a live record of their unraveling, a subtle but undeniable reminder that the foundation they had built on my contributions was thinner than they ever imagined, and that the consequences of excluding the one person who had kept it all from collapsing could be both immediate and humiliating without a single word spoken by me. The hotel manager's texts began appearing first, polite but pointed, indicating deposits had failed, Room upgrades were voided, and any special accommodations that my father had promised in his habitual overconfidence were suddenly nullified. And then the rental car agency chimed in, confused by the absence of a secondary cardholder that had been essential to validate a driver they had assumed existed, and all of it compounded into a pattern of small disasters that multiplied faster than a casual observer could process, but that I, with my careful ledger and months of intimate familiarity with their financial footprints, had anticipated and waited to witness with the patience of someone who had spent a year invisible. The text from my mother came next, frantic and clipped, lacking the false cheer she used to sprinkle over every minor inconvenience, and in between them the messages from my brothers revealed growing panic. Their usual smugness replaced by awkward questions and indirect pleas that made it clear for the first time that my absence was more than symbolic. It was operational, practical, and suddenly painful. The exact leverage I had quietly maintained, but never wielded in anger, only in preparation, and as I read each line I recognized the rhythm of desperation, the cadence of a family realizing too late that their autonomy had always depended on a single individual who now chose to observe from a distance. And the weight of that realization gave me a strange satisfaction that felt not like triumph, but like clarity, as though I had finally aligned the story of my life with the consequences they had tried to erase. I did not answer the first set of calls because it would have diluted the lesson, and I wanted every missed notification to compound their anxiety. Not out of cruelty, but out of the measured intention to demonstrate that exclusion carries a cost beyond polite conversation or passive aggression. The subtlety of my absence became a mirror in which they could finally glimpse the importance of respect and acknowledgement, and while the guilt that sometimes creeps into acts of retaliation whispered at the edges of my mind, it was overshadowed by the growing clarity that they had underestimated the consistency and intelligence with which I had managed their finances, their vacations, and their perception of normalcy for the last 12 months. I made myself a late lunch and sat by the window, watching sunlight bend over the horizon and feeling that strange mixture of calm and tension that comes when you are simultaneously the architect and observer of a crisis, noting each email, each text, each call as it arrived, and parsing the tone for cracks that would indicate the turning point, knowing that the moment they realized their mistake fully was the exact moment I had been waiting for. By evening, my mother's tone had shifted from irritation to near panic, the casual familiarity of her texts replaced by a syntax-heavy insistence on resolving problems she had previously assumed I would absorb without comment. And my father's messages carried a rare thread of uncertainty, asking questions that indicated he no longer felt entirely in control, and through the haze of their digital flurry I could discern the subtle hum of realization that their vacation, their carefully curated image of leisure and family cohesion, was fracturing under the absence of the one person they had always relied on to smooth the edges, keep the systems running, and protect their illusions. And it was remarkable in its quiet precision how quickly panic and incompetence filled the gaps where my presence had been. I finally opened the phone at night, not because I felt pressure, but because I was ready to witness the moment where their mismanagement met my absence with tangible consequences, and the string of missed calls, texts, and notifications revealed a crescendo of desperation that I had predicted, but could not have fully appreciated until I saw it arranged chronologically, each message a note in a symphony of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the one person they had disregarded possessed not only the power to maintain their world, but also the choice to step away and let it teeter dangerously, a lesson that was both instructive and unnerving in its intensity. And as I placed the phone face down again and poured myself a second glass of wine, I realized that the true measure of their panic was not in the words they had sent, but in the unspoken acknowledgement that the daughter they had excluded had never truly been optional. When they returned, the tension in the house was palpable, a thick layer of unspoken frustration, financial missteps, and personal embarrassment that hung in the air like smoke from a fire they had tried desperately to contain. And I watched quietly from the living room, my hands folded over the ledger that had tracked every dollar, every week of my contributions, and every moment in which I had been rendered invisible, while they moved through the rooms like actors unsure of the stage. adjusting their tone, fidgeting with luggage, and scanning the walls for some sign that the world had remained intact despite their absence, and it had, only because I had maintained it with a precision that they had assumed was automatic and unremarkable, which made their sudden reliance on explanations and passwords almost absurd, a delicate ballet of humility they had never rehearsed, but now had no choice but to perform. My mother approached first, her face a mixture of feigned calm and underlying panic, her eyes scanning my expression as if trying to anticipate whether my reaction would be anger or pity, and when she asked, in a voice that trembled despite her effort to remain composed, if I had changed anything major while they were gone, I allowed the silence to stretch long enough for the weight of a year's worth of financial oversight to settle in the room. And when my father interjected with a polite but strained inquiry about which accounts had been affected, I leaned back in my chair and explained, not as a rebuke but as an enumeration of facts, how every payment that had previously run through my envelopes had been paused in a way that complied with terms of service and left no room for misinterpretation, while subtly highlighting that my absence had been felt not merely in missed deposits, but in the cascade of minor crises that had erupted in their carefully managed vacation plans, leaving them scrambling in ways they had never expected. Kyle and Eric hovered nearby, their usual arrogance muted, the smirk of entitlement replaced by the uncertainty of being forced to witness a consequence they had never imagined, and as I walked them through the timeline, reciting each week's transfer and the corresponding bills, their reactions ranged from defensive mumbles to flustered explanations, and I allowed it all to unfold without interruption, because the lesson was more potent when absorbed through observation, when the recognition of dependency came not from confrontation but from the unavoidable reality of being excluded from the systems that maintain their lifestyle, and for the first time, I saw the subtle shift in their posture. A collective understanding that my presence had been essential, not peripheral, and that the narrative they had told themselves about independence and control had always relied on a quiet compliance they had taken for granted. When my mother tried to pivot to guilt, invoking the familiar lines about family loyalty and sacrifice, I countered with a calm precision, highlighting the difference between obligatory support given under duress and voluntary contributions made with recognition, and although she attempted to interject, I held the floor with the steady voice I had cultivated over months of silent planning, laying out not a litany of resentment, but an organized account of facts, showing that my choices had consequences that extended beyond envelopes and bank statements, into the very structure of their vacation and the illusions of effortless authority they had carried with them on that trip, and by the time I finished, the room was thick with a tension that neither side could easily dispel. The phone, which had remained face down on the counter through the initial confrontation, vibrated relentlessly, a growing testament to the desperation of the previous 24 hours. And I glanced at the screen to see a string of missed calls and text messages that ranged from tentative to outright frantic, but I did not answer immediately because the timing of response was itself a tool, and as I surveyed the room, watching their faces shift between realization, shame, and a dawning recognition of how easily the balance of power had shifted, I understood that the true measure of my revenge had never been about punishment, but about demonstrating the necessity of respect, acknowledgement, and the consequences of underestimating someone who had quietly borne responsibility for too long. Finally, as I placed the phone back on the counter and turned to the window to watch the fading light stretch across the living room, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and ambiguity, because the lesson had been delivered, but the final choice remained mine. And whether I would answer their desperate calls, whether I would restore access to the systems I had paused, or whether I would allow them to reconcile with the consequences entirely on their own, was a question I left unanswered. Knowing that the most profound statements are often the ones left suspended in possibility, and that sometimes the most powerful act of control is to simply hold the line and let others discover the depth of their reliance in the silence you maintain.